So our common purpose here today is to take a critical look at the Senate of Canada in both in its past, present, and prospective forms, in order to understand more fully the role of the Senate in Canada, what it does, what we think it does, what we think it should do, and what it might look like in the future. We should look at the implications, both intended and unintended, of the reforms that have been brought so far and the ones that are on the table. The new approach to appointments is just one example of how the Senate has changed in recent years, and already we can see some implications of this change. So, for instance, we can all apply to be senators now. The thing about changing any aspect of an institution is that the other parts have to recalibrate in order to adjust to the new realities, and this can take some time. With independent appointments, it seems to me that we now have less predictability in the Senate when it comes to the timing of legislation, the range of prospective amendments, how a bill is treated by committees, what the relationships are between senators, essentially how a bill is handled. This isn't bad. They aren't bad things. But the rest of the system needs to adjust to new changes that are being brought to the Senate, including, for instance, the public service. So I think it's safe to say now that the policy process is different now, with the senators taking a different sort of view and how they're organizing themselves differently. The policy process is different. It doesn't stop when it used to. So from the perspective of the public service, when we're drafting legislation, when we're advising ministers, when we're memoranda to cabinet, when we're going through that process, the Senate is now an unknown variable in many ways, in the sense that you really don't know. Timing-wise, you can't make any assumptions. You don't know how the thing is going to go through committee. You're not sure what the independents are going to do, how people are going to treat it, whether there's going to be unison among senators on committee or whether it's going to go in different places. Will any amendment that comes from the Senate change the intent of the bill? And what kind of tension does that create for the government when it's moving through its it's trying to move through its agenda? It's campaigning on a clear agenda, but saying the whole time, I'm not sure how this is going to work through the Senate. And so we all kind of have to adjust, and it's very exciting. And the Senate is a hot spot in a place, now that not that it ever wasn't, but in a different kind of way now. And so I'm really looking forward to the comments of our four panelists this morning and from you as well, so that we can all build a clearer picture. So enough from me. I will introduce each panelist separately and invite each to give 10 or 11 minutes of comment. I will be rude in cutting you off, so that we make sure that everybody gets their time, and then the audience has an opportunity to to ask you questions. So we're going to start with Senator Mitchell. Senator Grant Mitchell from Alberta was appointed to the Senate in 2005. He has had careers in the public service, business, and politics in Alberta, and was called to the Senate in 2005. In May 2016, he was appointed government liaison in the Senate, where, as one of 3 members of the government representative team, he helps guide government legislation through the upper chamber. He's going to speak to us this afternoon, about current reforms underway in the Senate. Thank you, Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Lori. This could be unpredictable. I am going to start my timer so that Lori doesn't have to yell at me. And that's better for me, although this isn't about me. Look, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, it truly is a pleasure to be here. It's fun to see Jim Cowan again and some of my colleagues who I've seen more recently, but Jim and I were appointed the same day, and we truly miss him since he's retired. I actually used to live in Nova Scotia. I lived in Halifax, I lived in Kentville, I lived in Wolfville, I lived in Seabright, went to a one-room school. I actually spent a summer at Hubbard's Beach, just meters from Jim Cowan, who I wouldn't meet for another 50 years. And this isn't widely known, but I attended university here. 61 years ago, I graduated from the Acadia University Nursery School. That was kind of the ultimate undergraduate experience. So several years ago, somebody made a striking observation to me, and that was that the parliamentary system of government is the most successful system of government on the face of the earth. It has lasted hundreds of years, longer than any other form of government existing today. And it's lasted, in my estimation, and probably, in fact, because it works. And it works for many reasons, but one of those reasons, perhaps not the most important, but one of those reasons, significant nonetheless, is the Senate. Canada, in fact, wouldn't exist but for the creation of the Senate, which was established to alleviate the fears of minorities and of smaller provinces like Nova Scotia. Thank you very much for pushing this issue, to alleviate their fears that they would be overwhelmed in a larger Canada. It has been populated by remarkable people, Alan J. MacEachen, of course, and by 3 colleagues that you see here. And people like these and like Senator MacEachen have influenced the public policy debate in the Senate for this country, across this country, powerfully and positively. It's changed the course of this nation for the better over the last 150 years. And so at this point, I often say to people, no matter what you've heard about the Senate, no matter what you think you know about the Senate, if the Prime Minister ever calls, say yes. This, of course, is running through your mind, I'm sure. So, Grant, if it's so great, why all this intensity to reform it? And, of course, the easy answer is the infamous expense scandal. I'm not going to diminish that, but I don't believe that that actually explains the whole issue whatsoever. I'll give you an anecdote. In the midst of all of this toing and froing that was going on, I go to a reception in Alberta, and this aggressive person comes up to me and rudely says, "You're a senator? You're like all those other senators. All those senators are the same, just like those bad senators and their bad behavior that we're reading about in the press." I said, "Wow, thanks for the input. Could I ask you a few questions? So what do you do?" "Well, I'm a doctor." "Oh, I see. So are there any bad doctors?" "Yeah." "So are you one of them?" "No." It's like that in the Senate. I don't believe that reasonable Canadians will define this remarkable, wonderful institution on the basis of the behavior, the bad behavior of a handful of its members. And even if it were the case that this was all about an expensive scandal, presumably you could fix it simply by changing rules, which the Senate has done and done extremely well. But would anybody actually believe that that's enough? I don't think so. I think the problem that confronted the Senate, or the Senate was confronting, was much broader and much more profound. And it was all but, and maybe, and hopefully not, an existential crisis of credibility. And it came from an accumulation. I look back, and about the turn of the century, I believe that politics in Canada, partisan politics, became extremely toxic. And it kind of, I want to say, festered from then. And it washed over from the House of Commons into the Senate. I know. I was part of it. Mea culpa. But I began to hear, sort of in lockstep with that development, more and more concern from my specific constituents, Albertans, Canadians more generally. They hated politics. They hated political parties. And they sure weren't very impressed by the Senate. I get partisan politics. I was elected 4 times as a Liberal in Alberta. Believe me, I get partisan politics. But the thing about an elected body versus an unelected body is that with an elected body, if you don't like partisanship, you can change the partisans. You can't do that with an appointed Senate. So about this time, in the midst of all of this, Mr. Trudeau made a profound, I think, decision to remove us senators, it hurt, from his national caucus. We sat with the elected representatives. And at the time, if you'd asked me, 5 minutes before I would have said that's a bad idea. The moment it happened, I felt relief, and it's been a revelation. I don't think that my values or my positions or what I've done in politics has been compromised by virtue of the fact that I've sat in a number of political caucuses, Liberal caucuses, over the years. But what began to dawn on me as I saw in retrospect where I'd been in the Senate was that my psychology was this. Every time I was about to do something or say something, I was calculating what the impact of that action or that statement would be on the electoral fortunes of the other side. So if I said carbon tax, and believe me, I believe in a carbon tax, even though I'm from Alberta, I would have to consider that Mr. Trudeau would likely be subjected to one of 2 criticisms. He'd either be criticized for being a weak leader of a now clearly divided caucus which he couldn't control, or he'd be criticized for supporting a carbon tax, or, as these things go, he'd be, of course, criticized for both. But even again, if this were not the case, if I weren't compromised, if my thinking was pure and I was absolutely independent, it dawned on me very powerfully that I simply couldn't convince anybody any longer that sitting in a national Liberal caucus with very powerful, very smart, very good, persuasive people, many of whom were very good friends of mine, I couldn't sustain the argument that somehow I was able to retain a nonpartisan objectivity and independence. Then the Supreme Court ruled, and it reinforced this whole idea that the Senate has to be complementary. It has to be different than the House of Commons. And if the one thing you can do to make the Senate different from the House of Commons, which is elementally partisan, is change the partisanship in the House, in the Senate. And as luck would have it, while you can't do other sweeping changes like abolishing the Senate or electing the Senate very easily, if at all, because of constitutional constraints, you actually can change the partisanship in the Senate. I'm just going to step back one moment, and I'm going to say that this is not to say that any of my colleagues who have decided to remain in partisan, label themselves as Liberals or Conservatives, and organize themselves as Liberal or Conservatives, don't have a right to do that. They absolutely have a right to do that, and nobody has a right to tell them not to do that. But I do think that if we're to be responsive to the public, and certainly to my constituents in Saskatchewan, there is an implicit question that needs to be answered. If senators are going to label themselves with a particular partisan party label, how is it that they can also retain or acquire independence from the other side? And there are two things that can be done to do that. One is you leave the National Caucus that you sit in along, excuse me, Thomas, that you sit in along with elected members of Parliament, and you ensure that your Senate caucus isn't whipped. And I want to say very clearly that the Liberal Senate caucus, under Jim Cowan, his leadership, great leadership, and since has conformed to both of those things. They are, in fact, I think, independent. So what else has been done to change the Senate? First of all, because the Prime Minister doesn't have an affiliated caucus in the Senate to manage his legislation, he's appointed 3 representatives rather than appointing the leadership of a caucus he doesn't have. So we have a representative, government representative, we have a deputy representative, we have me, who would formerly have been called the whip, but I have nobody to whip, and I have nothing with which to whip them, except, I want to say, my obvious charm. And as I was talking to my wife about this, she said, you know, Grant, I'm kind of, see a comparison between you and the Black Knight and the Monty Python Holy Grail movie. You know, there are days when you're in this position where you're literally hacked to pieces, but you seem to remain remarkably perky. It is challenging. Secondly, there is a more objective appointments process. And I'm not saying you get better senators. You had great senators, you're getting great senators. But what I am saying is senators like Senator Thomas Bernard are not burdened by a process that looked to the public to be inside and secretive and was driven by partisan loyalty. And thirdly, only senators who are determined to be independent have been appointed, and none, by definition, have joined a partisan caucus. And finally, rules changes have begun, and some of those rule changes have been established to help create the equality of all senators, independent senators. We still have more work to do. I'm going to summarize by saying that I'm not prepared to say that the Senate is doing better work now, because it has always done extremely good work. It is a great institution. But what I am prepared to say is that the changes to this point have resulted in a significant improvement in the Senate's credibility. You're not reading about scandal. You're not reading about disappointment. You are reading about excellent work by senators on your behalf. There's still a way to go, and in particular, I think we have to make sure that this is irreversible. And there's a couple of things that could occur to help that. One would be, and again, my apologies to Thomas, who's an excellent senator doing great work, but I believe that you've got to get senators out of elected caucuses. Once that occurs, that departure is far, far too difficult. It's insurmountable to go back. And secondly, all parliamentarians, and I think they're beginning to see this, need to feel the pressure, the public pressure that the public is really starting to like this newly configured Senate. The key is that if the Senate is to be effective, it has to be credible. I think we've gone a long way to getting there again. We have a way to go, but it's a wonderful, remarkable, exciting journey. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Mitchell. I'm going to welcome Senator Thomas McInnis of Nova Scotia, who was appointed to the Senate in 2012. Prior to his appointment, he was a career lawyer, and has been involved in politics for many years in Nova Scotia. He has served as the Minister of Transportation, Minister of Community Services, Attorney General, Minister of Labour, Minister of Industry, and Deputy Premier of Nova Scotia. Senator McInnis is currently the chair of the Special Senate Committee on Senate Modernization, which is tasked with creating a more open, more inclusive, and more effective Senate. The committee published the first part of its report, Senate Modernization Moving Forward, Part 1, in October of last year. And Senator McInnis is here today to talk to us about the work of the Committee on Senate Modernization.
Thank you, Laurie. Good afternoon. I'm flattered to be here at the MacEachen Institute. I don't have time, or I reminisce on some of my experiences with the Right Honourable Alan J. MacEachen, Alan J. as he was called, a wonderful individual and just a stalwart for Atlantic Canada, and has done so much. So good afternoon. I'm here this afternoon because of James Cowan, the former senator, who had the vision back in late 2014, early 2015, to modernize the Senate. So he introduced a motion in the Senate that was unanimously accepted, and I guess I drew the short straw in becoming the chair of the Modernization Committee. The committee's work was based on a number of organizing principles: sober second thought, bicameralism, independence, democracy, preservation of the rights and privileges of parliaments and parliamentarians, equality, regional representation, and minority representation. The committee has completed and presented to the Senate its Part 1 report, Senate Modernization Moving Forward. Within, there were 21 recommendations, including rule revisions to take into account the growing number of independent senators, as you can well imagine, the emergence of caucus not belonging to a political party, new definition of a caucus, predetermined procedure to deal with omnibus bills, broadcasting Senate proceedings, selection of a speaker, a procedure, organizing Senate debates, and population of the committees, just to name some. All of the recommendations were presented in 10 reports to the Senate. 5 have been officially accepted and endorsed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is difficult to predict what lies ahead for the Senate given its fast evolving composition. It needs to heal from recent controversy, and an ever-changing political landscape is at best a challenge. The main driver of change will be the increasing number of independents. Currently, there are 36 independent senators in what is called the ISG, the Independent Senators Group. There's 36 conservatives, 7 unaffiliated senators, for a total of 43 independent senators out of 95 occupied seats. 16 Liberal senators, 10 current vacancies, presumably will eventually be independent. And there will be an absolute majority of senators without political affiliation. 11 senators will retire before the next election in 2019, 8 of which will be Liberal or Conservatives. So in light of this, permit me to pose some questions. What is the future of the Westminster model of government in the Senate? Will the traditional government versus opposition in the Senate and its debates disappear? The Senate is an upper house and a bicameral parliament modeled after the United Kingdom's Westminster system. Most witnesses before our committee referenced the Westminster model, particularly the official opposition, as a necessary component of a parliamentary democracy. As one professor, as a witness said, will the Senate have an official opposition or 105 loose fish? The ISG is not led by the government representative, but by its own elected leadership. Will the ISG role evolve to be akin to the government of the opposition? Will all of these senators caucus, and if so, will they caucus by party? Will they caucus by issue? Will they caucus by regions? These are questions that will need to be addressed over the coming months and years. As we broke for the summer, I provided the Modernization Committee members with 2 discussion papers. The first was on the Westminster model and a summation of what the committee heard from 24 alleged expert witnesses, and the second on the relationship between the Senate and the House of Commons. The Senate plays an active role in reviewing legislation, which from time to time results in disagreements between the 2 houses of Parliament. Key to the proper functioning of Parliament is the determination of what the Senate's role is vis-a-vis that of the House, and how to resolve conflicts when they arise. With respect, I detect from many of the elected members in the House of Commons that the Senate should have minor, if any, suggested improvement to legislation. On the other hand, there are many in the Senate who believe that the Senate has a constitutional duty to resist and, if need be, to defeat legislation that infringes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom or other parts of the Constitution. With respect, some education and a proper determination of the boundaries of the Senate's role with respect to legislation is important to the implementation of new procedures and practices aimed at modernizing the institution. Should we have better mechanisms to resolve disputes between the 2 chambers? Currently, there is the exchange of messages between the 2 houses until one yields to the other. This usually is the Senate. But existing rules provide for free conferencing between appointed senators and MPs in order to discuss disagreements. No such conference has occurred since 1947. However, some believe this should be used or that we put in place another mechanism to avoid deadlocks. Now, in the interest of time, quickly allow me to reference topics that are on our committee's radar. 1, managing more efficiently the Senate's business. 2, putting in place a checklist of legislative review, i.e., is the legislation charter compliant? What is the effect on the regions of the legislation and its minority rights? And does the law already exist on the books? 3, private members' bills in cooperation with the House of Commons on amendment. If a private member bill is amended in the Senate and sent back, it normally goes to the bottom of the pile and is effectively dead. Now, ladies and gentlemen, broadcasting Senate proceedings coming to you in September of 2018. Not only will this improve visibility of the Senate, it will showcase the role and important work of the Senate. Concurrently, we are looking at how we can organize the conduct of debates in a more efficient manner. How's my time?
You're doing well.
I'm doing well, great. Let me then just touch on, no. In addition, we are revisiting the committee structure. Most of the Senate's work happens in the committee, and they do wonderful work. They review proposed legislation and conduct studies such as health care system and mental health, palliative care, autism, legislation on marijuana. Senate currently has 16 standing committees, 4 subcommittees, 1 special committee, modernization, and a special committee on the Arctic, just new, and 2 joint committees. And there is a call for 2 additional committees. Some suggest there are too many committees and that there is an overlap. We are looking at ways to streamline their mandates and make them more efficient. Finally, your discussion today focuses on where the Senate is headed and possibly options for the institution. With the makeup of the Senate ever changing, no one can predict with certainty where the Senate is headed, at the moment at least. Remember, in Canada, governments come and they go, many after only 1 term. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer has said that he will return to the appointment process of all previous prime ministers prior to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So the cycle begins all over. Is that a better way? And was there a better way? Perhaps we'll get into that in the question period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator McInnis. Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard was appointed to the Senate in 2016. She is a social worker, educator, researcher, community activist, and advocate of social change. Also in 2016, she was appointed Special Advisor on Diversity and Inclusiveness here at Dalhousie, and is the first African Nova Scotian to hold a tenure-track position. Senator Bernard is a member of the Senate Standing Committee on Agriculture and Forestry and the Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights. She was also the Vice Chair of the Canada-Africa Parliamentary Association. She will talk to us today about the new appointments process.
Thank you, Dr. Turnbull. In a sense, this feels like coming home. As a recently retired faculty member, of course, Dalhousie has been my second home for more years than I care to remember. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here on Mi'kmaq territory, and I'm grateful to be able to share the space. Grateful to be able to share the space with my honourable colleagues, and also honouring the memory of the late Senator MacEachen. I said to Dr. Quigley just before we started that I love what you're doing. So as a professor, let me tell you, students, you have here a rare opportunity to be engaged in a class that's meeting with real people around real issues. So that's incredibly exciting. And that's the main reason why I said yes to this, because I like this, and as an educator, certainly try to teach in that way. So I'm to talk about the new process. I'm one of the 21 people that was appointed to the Senate about a year ago through this new appointments process. So let me start by saying that if this new process was not established, I would not likely be here. So I have not been involved in partisan politics, although there have been many invitations to do so by all parties. But I've always resisted that partisanship. When I applied to become a senator, I did not apply with any faith that it would actually happen. I applied because I wanted to test the system. I did not believe that the process was going to be fair and equitable, as was proposed, as was promised. I applied because as a woman of African descent, as an African Nova Scotian woman who has spent her entire career working on issues of equity and inclusion because of the lack of equity, because of history of exclusion, because of a history of racism, because of a history of people of African descent really not being included in everyday practices that most people, most Nova Scotians, most Canadians actually take for granted. So after working on those issues for so many years, and when I saw the announcement, I thought, well, I should apply. I believe that the work that I've done may count for something. I believe that the work that I've done over the years may get some attention. But I have to be frankly honest with you when I say that when I received the call, I was absolutely surprised, because I did not expect that I would be selected. I really did not. And I think that comes from this whole history, this history of racism, history of sexism, history of the intersection of those realities. The whole history of all of that had put me in a place where I didn't believe that the work that I'd done would be viewed in that way. But it was. And when I got the call, I said yes. And the call came on the 11th, the day of the 11th anniversary of the date that we buried our mother. And I believe there was something in that message, that was coming at a time when my mother had dreams and hopes and aspirations that she wasn't able to attain because of racism and sexism and how they impacted her life. And for her daughter to be appointed to the Senate, I know that she would be beyond proud. To say that she would be proud would be an understatement. As a social worker and as a social work professor, I've been concerned for many, many years about the lack of engagement in civic issues for the majority of African Nova Scotians. And so being there and recognizing that the role of the Senate, the voice for minorities, sober second thought, it's so important. So I value the work of the Senate. But as Senator Mitchell was saying, the relevancy, the credibility had been really challenged. And so I would like to hope, I'd like to think that I helped to bring some of that credibility back to the Senate. One of the things that I do in my work there is that in every part of the work, I try to bring a social justice lens to the work. I try to bring that lens, that voice of people of African descent to the work. And I try to bring the voice of Nova Scotians to the work. As a small province, as a province that has many challenges, Nova Scotian senators, we have to bring those voices to that work as well. So I certainly try to do that. I'm excited about Senate reform. I'm excited about the modernization, the work that colleagues have done to try to bring about change, and I'm excited to be part of that change process. The work that we have to do, I think, is we have very important work that we're doing, and so removing the encumbrances of partisanship, of being whipped. And let me tell you, this is the first time I've said this publicly, I hate the term whipped. When I hear the term whipped, and some of you chuckled over that, let me tell you what happens for me. When I hear the term whipped, I think about the way that my ancestors were whipped. And it was not a pleasant experience. So every time I hear that term, I revisit the trauma. And I think sometimes we forget about the multi-generational and historical trauma that comes from practices. I have no idea, I haven't explored this, so I don't know why the term whipped has ever been used. And as I said, this is the first time I've said anything about it publicly, so I'll be inviting my colleagues who know about being whipped or whipping, I'll be inviting them to let's talk more about that and how we can change that practice, and certainly, at the very least, change the term, because the term itself is very offensive. When I first went to the Senate, I did not join the independent senators group. I thought, I'm going to be really independent, I'm here, I'm not joining that group. But after about 6 months, I decided that I would join the group because of a lot of different factors. It's not a caucus. And the independent senators group come together as a group to promote a more effective and a more efficient Senate. And we are independent in that group. We act, speak, and vote independently as individual legislators. So we're not, for want of a better word, we're not whipped in terms of voting, but we come together to try to work together in any ways that we can. And under the principles of equality and fairness, respect, transparency, and proportionality. And certainly it is a plan for the Independent Senators Group that as we go forward, as we're looking at committees, that the committee structure will recognize the independent senators can also be chairs and vice chairs of committees and have administrative roles in the Senate. And so we all have a voice. We all have an opportunity to use our voices, to exercise our voices in the Senate. And as an independent senator, it truly is a privilege and an honor to be there. It's also hard work. And I think one of the things we really want the general public to know is that we do work hard. I think there's a perception that it's not hard work. Just like professors, there's a perception that it's not hard work, but clearly it is. And it's important for people to know that. And I had set my timer, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. So our fourth panelist this morning is the Honourable James Cowan. He has considerable experience practicing law in Halifax and is a partner at Stewart McKelvey. He was actively engaged in the life of Dalhousie for many years, including as chair of the university's Board of Governors from 2000 until 2008. Mr. Cowan was appointed to the Senate in 2005 as a member of the Liberal Party of Canada. In the Senate, he served as opposition whip, leader of the opposition, and leader of the Senate Liberal caucus. He retired from the Senate in January 2017. In May 2017, Mr. Cowan's bill, S-201, to prohibit and prevent genetic discrimination, received royal assent and is now law. Today, he will share with us his observations about the role and evolution of the Senate.
Thanks, Lori. Thanks. Gave us a warning, don't touch the microphone. I just about did it, so. Thank you very much, Laurie, and it's a delight to be here. One of the disadvantages of going last, of course, is that many of the things that I might like to have covered have already been discussed. Perhaps off the top, I'm not an unbiased observer of the Senate. I'm an advocate of the Senate. I believe in the Senate. I was there for 12 years. Grant and I were appointed on the same day. And I've seen the Senate at its best, and I've seen it at its worst as well. And at its best, it does things that, as Canadians, we should be very proud about. So, and most of the senators that I served with were outstanding public servants who really tried to do very good things in their own way for the country. But like any institution, it can be improved, and Tom's committee is doing excellent work in trying to modernize, provide ways of modernizing the Senate without getting involved in constitutional amendments. There are two issues sort of left on the table that I thought I might address today. First of all, how does the Senate organize itself to do its job, particularly with respect to the review of legislation? And secondly, and Tom touched on this as being a subject that his committee is going to look at, the relationship between the House and the Senate. Now, we've heard various roles for the Senate, regional representation, representation of minorities, including political minorities, and policy studies, and everybody talks about the good work that Senate committees do in producing studies on major public policy issues. But for me, job number one for the Senate is legislative review, and that's the role that I want to focus on today. I want to give you quotes from two prime ministers to kind of set the context. First, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. He said this: "There would be no use of an upper house if it did not exercise, when it thought proper, the right of opposing or amending or postponing the legislation of the lower house. It would be of no value whatever were it a mere chamber for registering the decrees of the lower house." And the second quote from the current Prime Minister: "If the Senate serves any purpose at all, it is to act as a check on the extraordinary power of the Prime Minister and his office, especially in a majority government." Now, he said that at a time when we had a majority Harper government, but what's sauce is for the goose is sauce for the gander. The opening words of the reference on Senate reform in 2014 said this: The Senate is one of Canada's foundational political institutions. So I will argue, and I think I'm supported by the Supreme Court of Canada, that the Senate is a political body. Senators are politicians, and they make political decisions. When Alan MacEachen was appointed to the Senate in 1984, he made it clear that he was not joining some sort of debating society. He was going to make sure that it was and functioned as a legislative body. And Brian Mulroney found out very quickly what Alan J. meant by that. So in my view, the problem with the Senate has not been politics, but rather extreme partisanship. Politics cannot, and I would argue should not, be taken out of the Senate. What should be avoided is excessive influence or control by forces outside the Senate, whether that's the House of Commons or that's the Prime Minister's office. To me, to pretend that politics has no place in the Senate is naive and it's dangerous. The Senate is not a branch of the public service to be tackled with sort of checking the drafting of other public servants. It's not a debating society. It's not a council of elders. It's a legislative body. And that means, as the Supreme Court of Canada said, that it is a political institution. So to me, the objective is not to eliminate politics, but to ensure that politics and partisanship, and I think sometimes the words are used interchangeably and sometimes incorrectly, that politics or political partisan influence doesn't interfere with the critical independence of the Senate as an institution and of the equally critical independence of individual senators and how they carry out their constitutional responsibilities. So how should the Senate be organized to do its legislative work effectively? Traditionally, most senators have joined the parliamentary caucus of one of the major political parties. There have always been a few who have not done so. Now, none of the senators appointed by Mr. Trudeau has joined either the Liberal or the Conservative caucus, and most have grouped together with other non-Liberal and Conservative senators to form the Independent Senators Group, the ISG. Now, under our Constitution, the Canadian Parliament is a Westminster model, government and opposition. The current government leader in the Senate, the government representative in the Senate, suggests that we are evolving to a Senate where there will be no organized government and no organized opposition. And perhaps senators, if they organize at all, will organize themselves on a regional basis. I don't think that will happen, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the institution or the country that it does happen. For me, and I think probably all of us would agree that not only in the Senate, but we would know this in our lives, that like-minded people work together. And this happens, and like-minded legislators work together. It happens in every democracy around the world. That's how you get things done. Most issues that come before the Senate don't break down or categorize themselves on regional bases. If you think about national security issues or tax measures, it's hard to imagine that we would or would want to have a national political body breaking itself down on a regional basis. So groupings of like-minded legislators working together to achieve common goals in our parliamentary parlance are called caucuses. And until recently, and I think it's important to recognize this, in order to be recognized and funded, the Senate rules required that caucuses use the names of parties recognized under the Elections Act. Now, this is no longer a requirement, and Wanda belongs to the Independent Senators Group, which is funded along with the other recognized caucuses. Yet the government has not changed the Parliament of Canada Act, which still provides stipends only for offices of the government or the opposition. So Senator Mitchell and his colleagues, the government representatives in the Senate, receive stipends for their work. The opposition leadership receives stipends, but the leadership of the Independent Senators Group or the Senate Liberals don't receive any additional stipends over and above their Senate salaries. Now, you'll recall that, or you'll know that senators under our system are appointed by the Governor General on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. They can serve, don't necessarily have to serve, but can serve until 75. The Harper government brought forward some specific recommendations which proposed elections and term limits for senators, and there was a lot of discussion about whether that was constitutional, whether it was permissible under our Constitution for this to be done by the Parliament of Canada. It was referred ultimately to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the decision that I referred to said that those kinds of measures would require provincial engagement and provincial consent. Well, Mr. Harper at that point moved on to other things, and Mr. Trudeau, who was then the leader of the third party, promised a new, more open, transparent process, and Senator Bernard has talked about that process, which led to her appointment to the Senate. And there, I think that most people would say that the senators appointed by Mr. Trudeau as individuals are outstanding Canadians, and I think that they come with great backgrounds, and hopefully they will develop into great legislators. And as she said, none of those people have joined either the established caucuses, either the Conservative or the Liberal caucuses. Most have joined the Independent Senators group. Now, the CBC did an analysis in June of the voting record of the independent senators and found that most have consistently supported the government, more so than my former colleagues in the Liberal caucus. And that's not surprising to me. I think that most new senators would describe themselves as small L liberals or progressives. And while they almost without exception at the end of the day support the government, they don't operate under the whip or control of the government, and Senator Mitchell can tell you more about that. But what will happen, as will inevitably happen, when there's a change of government? Tom mentioned that Mr. Scheer has said that if he were elected, he would not follow the current process, but he would appoint people who were conservatives and who would support a conservative agenda for the country. And whether they're small C conservatives or large C conservatives doesn't matter. So what then? Suppose that Mr. Scheer is selected. What then? What will become of Senator Bernard and Senator Mitchell? My guess is that they will, together with other small L liberals, gather together and form an opposition. And that's as it should be. So I think that that's an important thing when we look forward to see whether that's where we want to go. I'll conclude with just one comment on the relationship between the House and the Senate. The Supreme Court of Canada made it very clear that one House is not inferior to the other. The Senate is complementary to the House of Commons. It's not a confidence chamber. It doesn't make or break governments. The two houses have essentially the same powers. There is no deadlock-breaking mechanism. And how have we avoided the U.S.-style deadlock or gridlock, which I think has characterized the system south of the border? We've done that because generally, not always, but generally, the appointed House, the Senate, defers to the elected House, the House of Commons. They provide their advice, and if that advice is not accepted, or to the extent it's not accepted, they say, we provided the advice, and we move on. So I ask the question in conclusion, will this change? As more and more senators are appointed who are unaffiliated with any political party or political caucus, and they are appointed and told to be independent, will they take this and say, well, why should we defer to the House of Commons? And so that's an open question. I think it's not a question capable of an answer today, but I think it's a question worth considering as we move forward with this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cowan, not Senator Cowan anymore. I'm used to saying Senator Cowan. Thank you very much for your fascinating insights. And I have to say, as you were speaking, especially with what you were saying, Mr. Cowan, I still kind of struggle with whether or not the adversarial model that we use to organize the House, what the implications are of organizing the Senate in the same way, and whether we have the same, like whether the constitutional imperative of the government and opposition is the same in the Senate as it is in the House, because the House, as you say, is a confidence chamber, and so the House has to provide an alternative to government or else the House isn't functioning properly. But the Senate isn't the same type of thing necessarily, in the sense that you're not looking to the Senate for an alternative. So I'm not sure, but I'm asking, I'm kind of putting this on, like kind of agreeing with your question, like about the organization of the Senate and whether the adversarial principle should be the organizing one in the same way. Anyway, we have a short list of speakers, kind of a speakers list for questions, and then once I get through that, we've got microphones floating around kind of thing. Perfect. Okay, so the first question today is going to go to Henry Klickner.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. My name is Henry Klickner. I'm a Master's of Political Science student. I'm also from the United States, so I have a bit of a jaded view on Senates in general. But I found everything all of you had to say very interesting, and my question is for Senator Bernard specifically, because you mentioned that you bring social justice and minorities, especially African Nova Scotians, to the Senate, which I think is great. It's literally your job. But you also mentioned that you want the general public to know about the hard work you do, and my question would be, since you brought up that specific point, how do we let the average Canadian know what the Senate is doing and why it's important? Because for the most part, they either think you don't exist or think you just spend money when you shouldn't spend money. So how do we publicize beyond just television the Senate?
Oh, do we?
Your mic just the table.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, that's on. That's live. Okay. So I think that some of that responsibility lies with us as senators to make sure that we're informing the public, and so the use of social media, I think, is pretty important. And we have one of the things I think that's just been revamped is the whole communications department and communication strategy. So there are lots of tools there that we can use, so that sort of informing. And I think there's more we can do in terms of teaching. So what we do in the public school system, for example. So having those kinds of conversations in schools, and that engagement in communities. So many of us do that, but maybe we do it and it's very private, only for the people who are involved. But finding ways to broaden that, I think, is really important. Social media is key, because more and more people are connecting and learning about what's going on through social media.
Thank you very much. Next question is John Stevenson, please.
Hi there. My question is also for Senator Bernard. Often in literature surrounding appointment versus election process, we see the idea that appointments can be a source of equity, depending on the source who's making appointments. And as you mentioned in your speech, even in the old appointment process, you don't believe you would have had the opportunity to serve as you are now. And I'm wondering, A, how your thoughts on that, on whether appointment can or should be a good means of serving minority people and getting them into the center of decision making, whereas Canada has a poor reputation for that.
Should we care?
The other room's on fire, so don't worry. We'd hope to set this room on fire.
That sounds kind of urgent. I don't know. Let's hang on. Oh, okay.
So are we good?
I think we're fine, Senator.
Yes, okay. So I didn't go into the detail. I'm assuming people knew, but let me just say, so for this process, one of the things I really liked about this process was that people had to apply, and there's an independent panel, and there were I think for the 21 vacancies at the time, there were 2,700 applications. So that's huge. One of the things that excited me about that was the fact that there were 2,700 people interested in serving, for whatever reasons. But the fact that there were 2,700 people that were interested in serving in the Senate, that in itself, I think, is really speaks volumes. to that kind of active civic engagement that we want to encourage. So that kind of process, I would support that as a way going forward for future vacancies as well.
Thank you very much. Next question from Jonathan Fontaine.
In my readings for this course, I noticed two interesting differences. An independent group, the Canadian Public Policy Forum, advocated for total partisan independence in the Senate. But this question is for Thomas McInnis. But the report that was actually released by the Senate contained a recommendation that's more or less maintained partisanship, even though it allowed for other caucuses as well. And you had mentioned that, well, the majority right now of sitting senators have a partisan affiliation. So do you think that it's likely we would be able to reform the Senate now independently, or would we have to wait for attrition and more appointments to change it? Because clearly there's opposition among those that are sitting as partisans now to the idea of getting rid of their partisan affiliations within the Senate.
Actually, the partisanship issue has not been one that's been dominant. I don't believe that there's a person, any one of the senators, that do not want reform. Sometimes change is a challenge, and we've seen that because it was in October of 2016 that we presented the reports in the chamber, and we've gotten 5 out of 10 through. But the partisanship has had little or nothing to do with this. I mean, it's across the spectrum. If you look at the individuals that hold the adjournment of those particular recommendations, they're all over the Senate. So partisanship has not played a role at all.
Thank you. Next question for Josh Jones, please.
Hello, my question's for Mr. Cowan. You expressed that you don't believe that we should structure the Senate along regional lines, but as Senator Mitchell mentioned earlier, that the Senate was designed to represent regional interests and to ensure that we're not provinces with a greater population kind of dictated the path that we went. Why would you want to support the opposition and government house thing or structure when the Senate is not the same as the House?
Well, I thank you for the question. To me, one of the things that we talk about, the Senate has a responsibility to represent regions, and do we mean regions or provinces? And to me, that always meant that I was there as a senator from Nova Scotia, and I looked at federal legislation, federal issues, sort of through a provincial eye, a provincial lens. But I didn't ever purport to speak for Nova Scotia. I would say, if an issue came up, I'd say, you want Nova Scotia's view on that? Talk to Premier Dexter or Premier Ham or Premier McNeil. I think I had, when I was in the Senate, there were provincial governments of New Democrat, Liberal, and Conservative. I had ready access to those folks at any time, and they were the ones who were speaking for the provinces. But I think that the Senate has a role, or senators have a role, to sort of look at these federal issues through a provincial lens. I think if you say to them, you need to caucus or organize yourselves according to, on a regional basis, which is what the government representative of the Senate in the Senate, Senator Harder, has suggested may be the way forward in his sort of post-Westminster style Senate. I think it's artificial. As I said in my notes, most issues don't readily enable you to identify a regional or provincial view on that issue. And I think that to have a federal institution which further divides the country on a regional basis is unwise. I think there are occasions when senators from a region could get together to talk about a particular issue. I know I tried to talk about post-secondary education or the oceans as an issue that could bring together Atlantic Canadian senators. I think that's fine. But on most issues, I think that people tend to have an ideological view or a view on a political spectrum. I'm not talking about party political, but they tend to be more left, right, rather than on a regional basis. That's what I meant.
Thank you. Abu Kantel?
Yes. Thank you very much, the panelists, for the wonderful deliberations. Very much appreciated. My question would go to the first speaker, Grant, I think Marshall. I actually want to understand the ultimate reason behind some sort of introduction of partisan politics in the Senate, because I understand that in the Senate it is not completely independent from partisan politics. At some point, some senators are independent, but you have quite a few of them that are probably aligned to partisan caucuses. So I want to know if this was even completely necessary, if we think the Senate should be completely independent. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Senator Cowan talked about the whole issue of partisanship, the word, and I think the other senators also alluded to that. It's very complicated, but what I'm really talking about, we're all partisans. You know, you like Volkswagens, I like Hondas. You know, when we argue about it, that's a part of, we have positions. We all have values. I remain a small L liberal, and Thomas is, among other things, a small C conservative, I'm sure. But the distinction here is the link through political party partisanship, the force of political party partisanship that was created because of the close relationship between caucuses in the Senate and caucuses in the House of Commons. I think that political party caucuses in the Senate served the Senate well in many respects to organize the work of the Senate. And I also think that the most powerful organizing principle in a Senate, in a political chamber, isn't regionalism. I agree with Jim on that, although that's important. I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm from Alberta. I believe deeply in a carbon tax. So if I sat down with other regional Albertans, I doubt that we'd agree very much. So the most powerful element of that is affinity, is values affinity. And that's, I think, ultimately how the Senate will organize itself. But what did caucus organization give us that made the Senate run well? Three things in particular, and I think there's more. One is camaraderie. Believe it or not, politics is a very lonely place. Because you're taking positions, you're getting beaten up, and sometimes you're competing with the person next to you for exactly the same thing. It's a lonely place. So you get camaraderie. A caucus is a place where you can go, and there are people who will be supportive generally. It's not always easy, but it's generally supportive. Secondly, you can try out ideas in a safe place. You know, you can say things that would otherwise be, well, might be stupid. You know, I've said them there, and I've said them out here. I probably have today. But the fact is that you can get feedback and refine those ideas, and it's a very, very creative process. It's also an essential element of the parliamentary system, which one of the things it strengthens is a place to build consensus. You need a bunch of places to build consensus. And finally, there's a lot of work to do. I can't know 50 bills. But I know Senator Thomas Bernard can know one of them, and I know Senator McInnis can know one, and Jim can know one, and we can do, although, you know, in the same caucus, the same group, we can have division of labor. So we can replace those three things in caucus groupings in the Senate that aren't affiliated directly with the House of Commons, because those senators aren't sitting in the elected caucuses on the House of Commons side. And I think if we sever that relationship, that line, yes, there'll be partisanship, and yes, there'll be people who call themselves liberals and conservatives, large L and small l, and large C and small c. But there won't be that same driving focus on electoral politics, and there will be a different kind of independence. And I think you see it in the Liberal caucus today. You certainly see it in the independents. And I'm not diminishing the great work of people like Senator McInnis, but I think, you know, it's a factor.
Thank you very much. If you do have a question to pose to one of the senators, and you can raise your hand, we can get a microphone to you. Over here, please. Oh, sorry. And
hi, my name is Kanar. I'm a first-year master's political science student. We've often Thank you all for the presentations. It was really insightful and interesting. My question is kind of for everybody. We've often thought about, or for a long time in Canada, thought about the Senate as a chamber for second sober thought, and even though it has the power to introduce legislation, it usually doesn't. I was wondering if that's a useful way of thinking about the Senate as only the second thought. I know that the Senate has done a lot of interesting research throughout the years. It's been way ahead of the House of Commons on certain things, like it was studying marijuana legalization back in the 70s. And I was wondering if it's useful to maybe think about the role that it could have in promoting legislation that might be outside the government agenda, and whether that could lead to more innovative policies.
Anybody?
Can I just jump in on that? I think that one of the things that needs to be understood is that any senator can introduce a bill at any time. If you, in the House of Commons, if you have a private member's bill, that is a non-government bill, there's a kind of a lottery system there. So everybody puts in a name and they draw 20 or 30, I forget which it is. And unless you can be in that top 20 or 30 or trade your way up into it, then your idea, your bill, no matter how good it is, may just never see the light of day. Whereas in the Senate, it can be introduced and debated right away. Now, the chances of a bill getting through the Senate and then through the House as a private member's bill are low, but at least it can get on the public record, in the public domain, and be the subject of a debate. So that's a useful tool, but I think most senators would probably agree that the primary role is a legislative review process, a sober second thought, rather than dealing with things first off. But the idea of being able to introduce bills and getting them into the public domain is something that I think is important.
A prime example of that is Senator Willie Moore, who is now retired. But prior to retiring, introduced S-203, which is to deal with cetaceans and capture and keep and capture whales, dolphins, and so on. And it's gotten considerable notoriety, literally internationally, that piece of legislation. We've had witnesses and meetings on this particular bill most of last spring, and it's continuing. And I don't know where the bill is going, but I can tell you, everyone that pays attention to these types of things certainly are well aware of the good intention of Senator Moore, and a number of groups that obviously approached him or worked with him to get it through. But sober second thought, you're absolutely correct. That's the genesis of the Senate. And I will say this very quickly, that in the Senate, what I've noticed, I recall being on Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and there's a great deal of work involved in that. When I do my research, I look at the House of Commons and the Justice Committee and the interrogation that took place of the witnesses there. I can tell you it was not even close to the way that the Senate handled that. There was no politics involved, or very little. Spasmodically, there was basically it was to deal with the issue at hand on the legislation, and that's what the Senate is excellent at. And there's not a category or an area that there's not some expert there in the Senate to deal with these issues. Which point's well taken.
If I could jump in as well, it isn't quite this easy to clarify, but basically sober second thought would apply to the review of legislation, because generally we get it after the House. However, governments do start legislation in the Senate. Any bill that's an S bill under 200 is a government bill, and there are a number right now. And senators start legislation. And Senator McInnis mentioned Willie Moore's. Jim Cowan's is a classically fine piece of work that very rarely has occurred up until about the last couple of years, that he got a piece of legislation through to the House, and he got it through the House, and he actually the Senate Liberals broke ranks to support it. So it's really remarkable. But where you get the more sober second thought, or get past sober second thought, as it were, and I think this is a very important role for the Senate. I don't believe, like other people, that all the best work is done in the committee. I have profound respect for the Senate chamber, and everything sort of generates that way. So, but the committee work is, in effect, work beyond review of legislation, where it does special studies. It's work that can break new frontiers. And the classic, of course, is Canadian mental health. But it's done remarkable work in many areas. In a sense, the committees are extremely efficient royal commissions. I loved royal commissions. But now they're out of favor because they cost so much money and they get away on you. But the Senate is extremely efficient. So there's a bunch of areas which I think the Senate, if I were running it, I would want it to see it do. For example, artificial intelligence is already doing a study on that. Maybe it's breaking boundaries there. A new tax, we haven't reviewed tax for 40 years. The Senate could do a tax review. I think retirement, pensions, all of that. 70% of Canadians don't have pensions. Of the 30 that do, 15% don't have defined benefit pensions. I mean, you got a long way to go, some of you, to retirement, but it's not getting easier. So there's that role of breaking some of the barriers of thought and of entrenched views of the world and saying, how can we change things? The Senate can go out across the country very inexpensively, very efficiently, and influence future public policy in these kinds of areas.
And I'll just add a little piece onto that. I mean, there are many examples of that already happening. So when committees do studies, that's really important. But also senators can introduce inquiries, and that can initiate work, both within the Senate and then beyond as well. So there are lots of opportunities. So it's not an either or. It's really how do we best do the work and bring forth the issues, and representing Canadians, which we're all required to do. I mean, that's essentially our role, is to represent all Canadians, no matter what lens we're doing that work from.
Thank you.
My question is for the Right Honourable retired Senator. What's a majority and what's a minority whip? And how do you become a whip? Do you get there by being a bully to other members? Is that what whip means? And my second question just goes to all of you. It's kind of like a short, simple yes or no question. Would you have rather become a member of parliament, or do you prefer being a senator? And maybe in 15 seconds, tell us why you would have rather be a member of parliament, even though it's temporary, unless you get re-elected, or why you prefer being a senator. Thank you.
Is this of me? The question?
I think, were you hoping that Mr. Cowan would answer the question?
Yeah, sorry.
But I think anyone should.
Okay.
Yes. Well, the term whip it's a British parliamentary term that refers to the level of importance that a government would attach, or a party would attach, to having the members of that party vote in a certain way. So in Britain they have 1-line, 2-line, 3-line whips, and you can, so it's simply a direction, or tradition was a direction to the members as to the importance of the particular vote that was coming up. So the person who coordinates all that, facilitates that, in our parliamentary system is called a whip. In my case, I was appointed the whip of the opposition not long after I came to the Senate, and then I was appointed subsequently as leader. And then when we became independent from the National Liberal Caucus, we elected our own leadership, composed of a leader, a deputy leader, and a whip. And other parties, other caucuses, either have appointed by leaders, or in the case of the Independent Senators Group, and I think certainly the Liberals in the Senate, and I believe the Conservatives in the Senate, do internal elections for their leadership team. That's the way it's done.
I could answer the whip thing a little bit, having been in umpteen caucuses and having been the leader of a caucus in Alberta, the Liberals. There's discipline. We should use the word discipline. So there's mechanisms, functional mechanisms by which the whip exercises discipline, and it's pretty basic, and I don't know how effective it really is, but they get to allocate officers, they get to allocate trips, and that kind of thing. That's got to stop, I think, and I think everybody kind of understands that. There's also just that whole issue of an affinity with people you sit with, that you grow to like, and we're human beings, and that's the power. I think that's the most power of caucus in some senses. You also, there are pressures that come from that. But it's not an art. I'm not a science. It's actually an art, that whole question of caucus discipline. But again, I think you break it a lot for senators if they don't sit in an elected caucus in that structured way and they don't feel that sense of obligation. I think that's really important. If you ask me whether I'd like to be a senator or an elected member of parliament, I was elected to the Alberta legislature for 12 years. It's way more, it's even more intense than the Senate. I like both literally equally. I'm not trying to be cute about that for different reasons. I will say that while the Senate is intense, it's significantly less stressful than having everybody on the other side yelling at you all the time.
I just want to say, and the whip keeps a quorum and makes sure that in the Senate, with respect to MP versus Senate, I've been elected for many years here in Nova Scotia and in the Executive Council, but the reason. The difference in the Senate is this, is that there's not the worry of re-election. You're not doing things specifically to get re-elected. You are doing things, hopefully, for the betterment of the country and the people. That's the difference. And that's why some people want terms, of 6 years or whatever. I don't believe that would work at all, because senators should have some time to get their feet under them, do research on interest areas that they have an interest in. And so that's why the importance of senators being there for some time and not the worry of an election, and not, candidly, necessarily the worry of doing and kowtowing to their boss.
Let me speak to this question as the only woman on the panel. I think it's important to recognize gender in politics. And the reality is the workload, the way the work is structured, travel, late nights, the expectations, the 24/7 workload are all things that make it very challenging for women to consider even running for politics or Senate. Appointment to the Senate, because those factors, we still have very gendered division of labor, of household labor, gendered expectations of child rearing and so on. And so unless the work really needs to take that into consideration, so we need to be doing work on the side of looking at gendered division of labor, household labor, but also we should be looking at, how we work, late nights, the impact that has, the travel schedule, impact that has on individuals and families, for both MPs and senators and at provincial level as well. So I think those are things that we need to table. We often have discussions about how to get more women into politics. We don't talk about those factors that keep women out of politics. Mm-hmm. And until we're addressing those issues, we won't get more women into politics.
Thank you. Mr. Cowan.
No, just one thing I perhaps mentioned just on the whip side. I think it's one thing if you have a group of elected members and you're trying to organize them in some way and you have some real control over their electoral prospects. It's another thing if you're trying to coordinate people who have been appointed for a term and there's really not much that you can do or say that will force them to do what you'd like them to do. So it is the art of persuasion rather than the art of coercion.
Mr. Cowan, I think you're trying to sidestep the question of whether you'd want to be an MP or a senator.
Well, I couldn't get elected to anything, so
no, you could now. Absolutely.
All right. I don't believe that. On behalf of everybody here, thank you so very much for a very, very informative and lively discussion. We really appreciate the candidness with which you've answered people's questions and you've spoken about your experiences. Senator, do you want to? Oh, sorry.
Well, if we have time, there was a CBC program, a comedy program that suggested that a senator wanted to interact with the Senate on Skype, and it was a big comedy thing. But I don't know, is it really that crazy? Does everybody have to be in a all the time, traveling back and forth, spending the money? Is it unreasonable? A lot of people work in one location and report to another. Is it unreasonable to think that people could stay in their communities more and interact in other ways?
It's funny, I'm unable to stay for the panel following this session because I'm chair of a particular project on the Eastern Shore, and I have to go to, I'm supposed to be there now, but I felt this very important. You're absolutely, the whip insists that you be there when the Senate is sitting. And that's some kind of measure of control. But I agree with you. I think senators do wonderful work, and there's lots of demand for them in the particular region they come from, and they should be challenged with some of those issues, not to interfere with the provincial politicians or the premiers. There's all kinds of general issues that we should take on and have the opportunity to participate in. So I think it's a very good point. Anyway, speak to our whips, will you? I think we're running out of time. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to make one more comment. So I had to find brave space to actually talk about how re-traumatizing the use of the word whip is. And it's been used several times in this hour that we've been together. And so I think that I'd like to sort of just encourage some thinking about alternatives. I know I think I appreciate the background from Westminster, but I think maybe the Senate modernization could look at that. Yeah. And I don't know if anyone has ever raised that, but let me just say that it's real. It's real. The impact is real.
I think that's a good idea. I'm saying all the time that I've used the word and heard it used, I'd never associated it in that way, and I think that's a very valid point that you made.
Anything else? Okay.
Could I just say one comment, because it's not been raised, and I haven't had I didn't take the opportunity in my opening remarks. I believe the appointment process that we currently have for senators is flawed. And I'll tell you why. I alluded to it in my remarks that when I spoke to Andrew Scheer, who appeared before our Atlantic Caucus senators, that he would revert back to the style that was there before the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, that they would appoint probably in a partisan way. Now, what happened here, and please, no one take this as political. It's not meant. I believe it was a political coup when Justin Trudeau, the leader of the third party, when he announced summarily that he would walk down the hall in the Senate, the Liberal senators would no longer belong to their caucus. And that's fine. And he got great review, and he showed that he could reform the Senate himself as the leader of the third party, just like that, without touching the Constitution. Now, let me tell you why it's flawed. Things always look good in the short term. Look in the long term. And what we are going to have is go back to the same old way. What should have happened is that he should have said, I'm going to try to caucus with the leader of the other parties to see if we can put a mechanism in place that we can appoint senators. Now, they chose the meritorious way, and that's fine. But you won't see many lobster fishermen or many people from the natural resources, perhaps the foresters and those people. You don't see those people being appointed. And I suggest that's flawed. And so I think there should have been a formula or a mechanism put in place with all the parties in order to appoint senators as independent as you possibly can. Think about that, because we're in for a merry-go-round in terms of how the Senate is appointed, only because someone was able to pull off a political coup. And that's what happened.
It pains me to have to close this now. Like, you have no idea. I'm dying up here. But Kevin is going to do that thing like they do in the Muppets where the person comes out with a cane. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you.